My online personality as a host of this channel is, by design, a divisive one. There are many Apple apologists that believe me to be hypercritical about the faceless corporation they hold dear. And then on the other spectrum, there are many Apple haters that erroneously herald me as the one that uniquely speaks the truth about Apple. They're even dumber than the fanboys. But both sides have agreed, be it in anticipation or perturbation, that I was going to have a heyday ranting about Apple's new iPad lineup. Well, to them I say, as Shakespeare's Timon of Athens said to that misanthropic philosopher Apemantus, "I'll beat thee, but I would infect my hands." So, video retort, I choose you! I know why you're here, so let's chat. What do I actually think about the new base model, in air quotes, iPad? Well, I've been using it for almost everything for the last 2 weeks. This video was written on it. And it's a good iPad. It's not the best iPad, but it's a good iPad. The A14 SoC still feels plenty fast for just about anything that iPadOS is capable of, Stage Manager excluded, although I don't know that you would want to use that anyway. The display, whilst unlaminated and subsequently further away from your finger or stylus tip resulting in a slightly less immersive experience, looks very nice. The colors are accurate, and while it doesn't support P3, you're probably not going to notice in an iPad workflow anyways. The display's pixel density is identical to the iPad Air, and it gets equally as bright at 500 nits. The device is a little bit thicker and heavier thanks to that older display technology, which is kind of a bummer, but on the flip side, the thicker bezels give it a much greater thumb and hand feel. I will remark that the lack of an anti-reflective coating on the display, it's noticeable when you're in the sun, or near the sun, or a light that's reflective. And the contrast ratio of that display, it's also nothing to write home about, which is particularly noticeable when you're watching video content. Now, it does have better speakers. They are landscape speakers that radiate out both ends of the iPad. Now, the prior generation did have stereo speakers, but they both radiated out of the bottom of the iPad. Now, top and bottom, or side to side if it's in landscape. Now, the speakers, they're pretty lousy, with poor separation, muddied vocals, lacking low end, and fat mids. I wouldn't ever choose them over my AirPods or, frankly, the iPad Pro, which just destroys them, and those speakers sound pretty good. But the speakers on this new iPad are fairly comparable to the current iPad Air. The same competent cameras found both front and back on said more expensive iPad Air are also found here. And finally, the front-facing camera is in landscape orientation, ergo, the orientation in which you use an iPad most of the time, especially when taking FaceTime or video calls. Now, if your name is Bill Gates and you shart money, you also might enjoy the new Magic Keyboard Folio, or at least I think that's what they call it. They all basically have the same name. The new eye-wateringly expensive $250 keyboard. It's quite good. The key and trackpad feel is fantastic. Apple's best attempt yet. In fact, the keyboard feels so good, it basically feels like a MacBook. And the new function row, something that you would also find on a MacBook, is superb. I have been using it nonstop and visiting Control Center far less as a consequence of that. I am a big fan. The whole kickstand folio design is, well, the already thick and heavy iPad, at least compared to the rest of the lineup, gets even beefier. That case is 50% heavier than the iPad itself and brings the combined weight to that of the much larger 13-inch MacBook Air. But on to the true controversy. The pogo pin and pad design to connect to these smart keyboards that's found on the iPad Pro and iPad Air is exactly the same on the new iPad, except for, no it isn't, because they moved it from the back of the iPad to the side of the iPad. Now, this does permit the detachable keyboard nature of the new accessory, but it mostly feels like artificial segmentation to keep accessories for the Pros and the Airs separate from this poverty iPad. And that's really, really lame when your accessories are hundreds of dollars. Why? Just enable them to work across the entire lineup. So as I said, this iPad is a good iPad, but it was designed by operations management more than actual designers, and nothing is more telling than, yes, this. Support for the first generation Apple Pencil, and that generation only. Now, we've all seen the memes, and yeah, they're funny because they're absurd, But the only way to pair the pencil to the iPad is by plugging it into the iPad, which you can no longer do like the old ridiculous way. The new ridiculouser way is with a USB-C to C cable and a little tiny $9 adapter dongle, which we don't have, by the way, because these pencils are back-ordered 3 weeks and the adapters. And if you try to use it the old way with the old adapter, you can charge the pencil but not pair it. What? But here's the brutal truth. Are you ready for it? This is all right. It's not great, but it's fine. Sure, it seems weird to have these squared off edges that debuted specifically designed to accommodate that second generation pencil while not accommodating the second generation pencil. And having a dongle anywhere in the stack is janky. But is it really that dissimilar from this? For years, Apple was prioritizing design over usability, and we complained. Now, they prioritize usability over design, and we still complain? Now, many have used the old trope, this would have never happened under Steve Jobs' reign. And do you know what? This time, that is 100% true. The first generation pencil would have been killed the minute that the superior second generation came out. But at a cost, it's still more expensive. Ive's team would have designed this new iPad, and the OM guys, Tim Cook, would have said, Steve, we're running the numbers, and we can't really maintain margins with this build of material, so let's use the first gen pencil. And Steve would have said, no. Instead of this, we'd have gotten this, no pencil. You want the pencil? Go buy the Pro iPad. Today's Apple, Cook's Apple, likely conducted market research and determined that, the majority of end users that want pencil support, they're buying the Air and they're buying the Pro, not the entry-level iPad. But that there are price-sensitive markets, like education, that want a stylus, and rather than just forfeit sales, they compromised. Those compromises have made this entry-level iPad feature complete, capable of doing nearly every single thing that the high-end iPad can do, just slightly less elegantly. Introducing weird entry-level products and maintaining old models at cheaper prices has been a staple of Cook's strategy for the last 10 years, and it has worked well. This is not the exception, this is the norm. The problem, however, is when you let these cost-focused hardware concessions enter the Pro lineup, which is why I'm not actually pissed off about this iPad at all. I'm pissed off about the new iPad Pro. The Magic Keyboard, it was not updated. None of the accessories were. So if you want that pro-level function row that is amazing, that makes the iPad better, well, you're only going to find that on the entry-level iPad. Furthermore, that awesome landscape camera, it's not on the new Pro. It's still in its old position here. Now, one could reasonably suggest that, the hardware required to dock and charge that second-gen pencil, that's in the way of where that landscape camera would go, and that would require reworking or redesigning the now 4-year-old form factor. Yeah, when it's your top-of-the-line model, and its price point can be configured to over $2,000, it doesn't matter if it requires reconfiguring. You reconfigure. Because a lower-end product should never get a premium-level feature a generation or generations in advance. Apple needs to be really careful here, because these concessions in their Pro lineup, while small, chip away at the foundation of Apple's entire value proposition. Think of price and experience as two lines, but lines that are ideally close together. Now, you can increase the price of a product, or you can make product concessions in software and hardware. But the more of each you do, especially simultaneously, the greater the delta between the two lines. And suddenly, you discover that customer satisfaction has dropped like a rock. The last few months have not looked kindly on Apple. Tension with developers continues to rise with the monolithic control that Apple has over the App Store. There is a growing likelihood of a federal antitrust suit in the United States filed by the DOJ. When the United States government files an antitrust suit against you, you have screwed up. And that's not all. The introduction of more ads into the App Store, most for icky gambling and psychic reading apps, which in and of themselves violate the App Store guidelines, but are there because Apple makes money on them, are being found on apps for recovery and addiction assistance. To be overly generous to Apple, it is completely tone deaf. On the Apple TV, they updated a server-side setting that draws focus away from the up next row. It's one of the Apple TV's best quality of life features. It takes all of your streaming services and shows what you've been watching in a single line so that you can continue watching. That's no longer the focus. It has been ousted in favor of full-screen ads for Apple's own shows and the shows of whomever wants to give them advertising money. There will soon be regional news posts placed inside of your weather app as part of iOS 16.2 to encourage more Apple News Plus subscriptions. Now, by themselves, these things aren't that big of a deal. Frankly, they please shareholders, which is Tim Cook's primary responsibility. But in mass, these changes come at a cost. This year, every single smartphone maker has had a huge drop in shipments, except for Apple. The PC market has been hammered over the last 12 months, but not the Mac. The wearables market is all but dead, unless you sell something called the Apple Watch. Much of the reason cited by industry experts for the reason that Apple continues to grow in spite of global economic pressure is that Apple has not made the end user the product. Tim Cook has inarguably been one of the most successful CEOs in history. He has made Apple the most valuable company in the world, worth more than Google, Amazon, Meta, and Netflix combined. Now, in my opinion, most of this has been due to the permanence of the Steve Jobs ideology that making great products is what maximizes shareholder value in the long run, ignoring and not electing to do short-term concessions or compromises for a little bit of money here and there. Now, many critics of Apple have proclaimed and continue to proclaim that the lack of innovation is what is going to be Apple's downfall, that Tim Cook is going to drive the company into the ground. They've been saying that for 10 years, and Apple is worth 10 times what it was when he took over. Apple is fine. Good products will keep coming. But as time goes on, Apple has to be careful that it doesn't lose that little bit of what made it special to begin with, because you can continue charging a premium until the only area where you're different is the price that you charge. And by then, you're no better than the rest. There's still time. This is a cautionary tale, but Apple has really got to reevaluate and be careful. Stay snazzy.